Welcome to Corporate Therapy, the podcast where we unpack the dumb stuff businesses do. We ask the big juicy questions like why, what were they thinking, and then we chase down the answers. I'm Matt, your corporate plumber.
And I'm Rob, your leadership locksmith.
Now today's topic is one that we think is actually on the rise, and that's quiet workplaces. And no, not the good kind of quiet. We're talking about the tension you can cut with a butter knife, that kind of quiet. Now, Rob, you've been around for a wee while, one would say. Ancient might be another word.
Ancient is a word people use sometimes, yes.
So I'm guessing like you've got a bit of experience when you walk into a business and it's deathly quiet. What's your first instinct when you see or you hear that silence?
My first instinct, I think, is remembering those old war movies where you see the two soldiers walking through the jungle in Vietnam, and one of them goes, "It's quiet," and the other one goes, "Yeah, too quiet." That's always my concern. I'm a guy who enjoys a little bit of quiet and enjoys a little bit of introspective time. But when I walk into a workplace and it's really quiet, my first instinct is to be a little bit on edge. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing to have a quiet work environment. I've seen quiet work environments simply because everybody was focused. But I think that's rare. Most of the time when I hear a workplace that's too quiet, particularly in modern open plan offices, my gut feel is there's a fear here. There's something that's not right. I've experienced this myself, just walking through the bush. I do a lot of trout fishing in the mountains and you'll hear birds singing and kangaroos barking and all of that sort of stuff. But occasionally it'll just go deathly quiet and you're like, what's, you feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit. And usually what you'll find is there's something around, something that's stopping all the birds singing, something that's frightening the kangaroos. There's a big fox around or something like that. So yeah, my initial reaction is one of there's a fear motivator here somewhere.
But if we think about some of the listeners who might be thinking, but hold on, my place is quiet, but my team's awesome. We're just very professional in this environment. How can you get some clues as a manager if that quiet is sinister or it's leading down towards that focused professionalism?
It's difficult to spot.
Yeah.
And I think it's difficult to spot because if teams are really focused, they've generally got a little frown on because they're like, I've got to get this thing done because this is the most important thing. This is the thing the CEO told me to work on and told all of us to work on. So we're really focused at the moment. And that little frown is there. But that little frown is also there when people are living in a fear-based environment, an environment where they feel like they can't speak up or they can't challenge the status quo. So it's really, really difficult to see. I think the only way that you can really work out whether it's focus or fear is by interviewing the people that are there, having a good old conversation with them and going, hey, I couldn't help but notice it's kind of quiet around here. Now, I've been in a workplace where if somebody said to me, hey, it's really quiet around here, I would have gone, yeah, it's really quiet around here. It's really quiet because we're flat out. And if we don't get this thing done, the whole business is going to fall apart. So that's professional focus. But it's pretty rare from what I've seen. I've only experienced that once in a 28-year career, So I think it's pretty rare. It's usually that there's a fear-based motivator in there.
For me, I look for clues in meetings, like does anyone actually speak up? Does anyone sort of ask questions? Does anyone share ideas? I go to the lunchroom in particular to kind of say, okay, is there at least some chatter that's happening in that environment? Or in the hallways where people are away from this and they may just be trying to be really respectful of folks in that room, but are they talking? Like, is there conversation? Is there anything more than the hum of the keyboard in that place? Because it feels very oppressive, but that might just be me, Rob, because I grew up with 4 sisters. Our place was bedlam. I mean, we were absolutely at each other's throats one day and then laughing the next. So for us, when silence came about, it was like, warning, Will Robinson. It was danger, imminent. And the problem is because it was 4 sisters, it was like a collusion. They were plotting, and that was never a good thing as far as I was concerned. So maybe I've just got sort of PSDD from a childhood associated with quiet's not a good thing.
I don't think you're wrong there. I mean, there's a couple of things you mentioned that I think are interesting. You said you could be at each other's throats and then laughing later. I think laughter is one of the things that you look for in an organization that may help you to believe that it's focus more than fear. If you hear a little bit of laughter going on, particularly in downtimes, in the lunchroom, in the corridors, things like that, that's usually a good sign in a culture, in an organization. But the other thing that you mentioned was the fact that quiet usually meant something bad was going to happen. I remember my old man, he would hear myself and my sisters go quiet, and instantly his reaction was, "What are you up to?" So I think it's a fairly natural thing in humans to consider quiet a bit of a threat.
When it comes to conflict, I don't know if it's an Australian thing. We seem to avoid it like the plague, right? It's what is it that's driving us to avoid having some of the healthy debates, avoid having some real conversations? I mean, what's behind that? Why do you think folks are avoiding conflict?
I think there's an evolutionary bent to this, if you like, where it used to be really, really important that we avoid conflict. Because if you didn't avoid conflict, you could end up in a physical altercation with somebody. And if you were injured in any way, that meant that you couldn't go out and hunt and forage for food or get water or build a shelter or whatever. And that was something that, had a pretty detrimental effect on your life unless you had a couple of good mates around you. So we have this evolutionary tendency to avoid having any sort of meaningful conflict. But I think we've also stepped away from the noble art of debate. When I say the word argument to people, they automatically get a picture of two people screaming at each other. Whereas argument used to be Socratic dialogue. Here's my opinion. There's your opinion. Let's balance the evidence and see who comes out on top. That used to be a really good way to work stuff out, and one of the things that I've noticed is that in stepping away from that conflict, stepping away from the debate, we have less trusting relationships because of it. We tend to be, and some of this is the political or geopolitical environment at the moment. We tend to try and divide people along lines, that you're either red or blue. We don't really talk too much about, well, I'm red, but I like some of the blue guys' policies, or I'm blue, but I don't like some of the things that the blue guys do, so I prefer the red guys or whatever. But we've sort of taken the nuance out of it. And to me, I think technology is a real problem there. We tend, rather than going and having a conversation that could result in conflict, we go, I'll just send an email or I'll send a text message or something like that. One of the things I've noticed is I go camping a couple of times a year with a few friends of mine. And we specifically go to the same place. We've been going there for 20 years now. And the key reason that we go to this place, aside from the fact that it's extremely beautiful, is that there's no phone signal there. So we sit around a fire and we have a good debate. And the interesting thing is there's a couple of us there that lean a little left on the political side of the spectrum, and there's a couple of us there that lean a little right. And we often end up coming to some real common ground. And I think that's mainly down to the fact that we can't ask Google what the answer is. We have to actually make a passionate case for whatever your opinion is. And that tends to sway people, or at least help them to understand where you're coming from. I think our fear of conflict often leads us to using email or using text or something like that, rather than having a face-to-face communication with a person where you get the nuances, where you see the curiosity in somebody's eyes, where you see them think about the point that you've just made and realize that might be a sticking point, And to me, I think that's the real issue, is that we need to learn how to lean into an argument.
Do you feel, though, with COVID, working remotely or even hybrid, that communications got kind of harder? And has that had any knock-on effect on our ability to work through conflict?
Yeah, I think it has. It is fair to say that communication has got harder. And I think, I think in some ways communications got harder. I think in some ways it's got easier. It's great to be able to send somebody a Teams message or something. If there's just something really simple that you need to go, hey, don't forget we've got this podcast to do at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Something like that. That makes life so much easier, just to be able to drop a text or a message or whatever it is. The issue is when we're leaning into something that has the capability or the potential to turn into conflict, to turn into a disagreement between us, to turn into an argument of sorts. Whereas the text and the email and so on can save us with simple points to get across. When we're looking at something that's nuanced in some way, I think it's more important that we lean into the face-to-face, or at least something like what we're doing now, where you can at least see the other person and see what's going on their face and in their head, hopefully.
God, that's a scary place to think, isn't it? But speaking of scary, I would like to spend a bit of time looking at what's sort of fueling these fires. If we can just go through, because I did a bit of work and there was a bloody long list of anything that could trigger conflict. In fact, it would probably be a shorter podcast to talk about what won't trigger conflict. But what's some of the items that's top of mind for you, Rob, that absolutely spark conflict in a workplace?
I can understand the list being, bigger than Ben-Hur. And I think you're right. It would be easier to talk about what doesn't spark conflict. Any sort of communication that can lead to misunderstanding. And I think one of the things that we just spoke about was, the idea of texts or emails or so on. Those are really, really easy to misunderstand because there's no tone in there. We've spoken about this before. And when there's no tone in there, we apply our own. Yeah. That to me is crappy communication. If there's a chance that your message is going to get misinterpreted, deliver it in the way that it's least likely to get misinterpreted, which is a face-to-face thing. If you're sending emails to people about, there was an example during the week that I had where a friend of mine was talking about the outcome of an internal investigation that was done in his organization. And he said, I got an email back to tell me about the thing that was all written in legalese, and it made no sense to him at all. He was misinterpreting it in a huge way, because the subsequent meeting that he had with the HR person to discuss it made it crystal clear. So why not have that conversation first rather than use the legalese email? So to me, crappy communication would be right up there. If you have a certain amount of communication skills available to you, use as many of them as you can.
Would you be surprised to know that we lose on average about half a day a week to shitty comms?
I would consider that a low number.
So it's not surprising then if you take the crappy comms and it's creating rework for folks, it's leaving people guessing, it's frustrating them. Add to that, they're already in an environment which they're feeling like it's a pressure cooker. They are stressed to the max. They are stretched. And I think on one hand, you're hearing organizers say, we need to lift productivity. On the other, you're hearing staff saying, I'm broken. Right? The stress, the burnout levels are at record highs, in particular for middle managers. And so I think we've got to be very mindful if we're wanting more production or more productivity to come out of our organizations, we're really going to need to look long and hard at actually how we set people up to succeed as opposed to just bury them. So to me, workload, poor capacity planning, inability to realize, hold on, you're asking people to stay back when you shouldn't. To me, that's become almost epidemic. And I'm seeing the younger generations get told or get singled out for, you just don't know what hard work is. Well, maybe they've got it right. Maybe they're starting to question some of the dumb behaviors where the line needs to be drawn. And that means for middle managers and senior execs, we need to recalibrate what does hard work actually look like, but what does fair work look like?
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's also important to realize that, we've been complaining about the younger generation since Socrates was a boy. There was a really interesting thought that I saw, which was a guy had put up on a PowerPoint slide, this huge list of complaints about the younger generation and how they wouldn't know a tough day's work if it hit them in the face and so on. And he asked us, who did we think said the quote? And we were all thinking, oh, well, maybe it was Steve Jobs or it was Jeff Bezos or whoever it was. It was Socrates.
Wow. But when it comes to role clarity, that is one that kind of surprised me a lot. It's like only a third of our workforce actually feels they have role clarity, which is a stunningly low number. And so when that sort of happens, finger pointing normally as quickly follows, where it's like, well, they should be doing X or they shouldn't be doing X. That's my role at that point. And so that misunderstanding is what fuels a lot of conflict in the workplace. Add to that, people are already stressed with workload and that communication is not. You can start to see this layering like a bad mud cake.
Yeah, and it all builds up into some really shitty behaviors at the top. If I'm worried about the fact that somebody else is taking over a part of my role, well, I'm gonna be aggressive with that person. I'm gonna look for every possible opportunity to reclaim my turf, if you like, you know. So all of these layers at the peak of them all are some really shitty behaviors. And the trick, I think, is to not deal with the shitty behaviors when they become a problem, but to deal with all the layers below that are leading up to those shitty behaviors to begin with. You know, when somebody is not behaving in the way that you would expect them to, we've spoken about this before. It's important to be curious about why they're not behaving in the way you expect them to. And I think all of these layers that you've mentioned are usually where the problem lies, you know.
Because one of the challenges of modern business is we're actually becoming more of a low trust environment. We're not trusting our colleagues. We're not trusting our leaders to make decisions that are in our best interests. I think something like only 40% of execs or 42% of execs actually trust their colleagues. And if that's at the top level, you can imagine how that starts to, you know, pass shit down all the way through the organization. And you start to see really unhealthy behaviors. One of them being micromanagement. I'm going to profess that I have at times been a micromanager. And Rob will know that well. Wouldn't you, Rob?
Well, we all have been. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. You know, we talk about micromanagement as if it's something somebody else does. I think it's brave of you to admit that you've been a micromanager in the past. I know I have been. Yeah. But if you look at the circumstances that you were going through at the time, you were desperately trying to get control over something that seemed out of control. And you thought the best way to do it at the time was micromanagement, right? So again, it's another one of those examples of here's somebody behaving in a way that I wouldn't expect them to behave. Oh, because they're trying to get control over that horrible thing that they're dealing with. You know, yeah. I think we need to be really, you know, we almost need to be amateur psychologists. We need to go, this is not the person I know. Let me work out why.
But I'm curious to hear from the listeners, if they put in the comments as well, is what are they seeing as some of the actual challenges when it comes to some of the behaviors that are leading to conflict? I mean, we've covered off a number here from not listening to workload, to stress, micromanagement, shitty behaviors, crappy comms, trust deficit. There's a huge long list out there. Is conflict on the rise though, Rob, or is this just something only I'm seeing, or what's your take on it?
I think conflict is on the rise, and I think conflict is on the rise because it's not dealt with early enough. You know, you mentioned something there, which was the trust deficit. Yeah. I mentioned those three boys that I go camping with a couple of times a year. We trust each other like you would not believe. We also have some fairly massive conflicts. Yeah, because there's no leader in our group. There's no hierarchy. We are aware of the fact that some of us have different skills, different pieces of expertise that add to the camp, that kind of thing. But there are often times where we have a difference of opinion about something. Yeah. Where somebody will want to go and have a big adventure this day, whereas somebody else will just want to sit by the fire. And there's a bit of an argument that's had around that. There was one I was thinking about recently. We tend to go camping on the coldest weekend of the year. So large fires are important. Yeah, it was -6, I think, the last time we went. So we will go off and we will collect a whole heap of firewood. And at one point, one of our crew was trying to get another member of the crew to reverse the truck up into this particular spot where there was lots of wood that we could load into the back of the truck and drive it down. And the driver of the truck was like, sketchy. It's sketchy getting up there. If the truck slides, we're kind of screwed and blah, blah, blah. And this argument started. No, it's fine, mate. Just come on up. It'll be easy. No, I can't. I'm going to slide the truck and blah, blah, blah. And there was a tension that dropped on it. But practically instantly, the guy who was waving the truck up said, hey, there's tension here, and I apologize for my part in it. Straight away. That builds trust, as far as I can see. That ability to acknowledge there's tension here, there's conflict here, and I had a part in creating it. That builds trust. That's why the four of us would follow each other into hell. That's why we're trusted friends, is because we're able to have a conflict like that, but also we're able to acknowledge our parts in it. I think that's a really important thing to do. And to me, that's why conflict is on the rise, because we don't acknowledge early enough that we have a part in this.
One of the areas I particularly struggle with, though, Rob, is when folks are just deathly quiet. You know, you'd be in a meeting, there's no questions asked or there's no feedback. And then the moment you leave that, an email hits your inbox and it's pretty much, hold on, this is very different to what we just discussed in the meeting that we just had face to face. That absence of feedback or clues makes it astonishingly hard to be able to navigate it. So just like the example you talked about where the person acknowledged, hey, there was tension. I mean, there was a conversation that was happening. But when people are passive aggressive, there is no convo. And one of the ones that I'm completely stumped on is the Gen Z's blank stare, where it's just there's zero feedback. And I've said something probably idiotic or hasn't quite landed, not sure. That's the whole issue, because I'm just getting a blank stare back and I don't know whether I should go left or right. I'm asking very much openly around something I said offended you, has something missed, do I need to clarify? I'm literally guessing at this point because I have no clues from either body language, tone, other than silence. What's your advice to people when working with individuals who are extremely passive aggressive, who choose not to engage in providing, helping to resolve the tension?
So I've had a situation like this that cost me a job at one point, where I was basically putting together a fairly massive culture change plan for a particular organization. That's what I had been hired to do, what I'd been asked to do. And I went to all of the senior managers in the organization and did my politicking to try and get their buy-in on it. And all of them were telling me that, yes, great idea, let's run with it. And then behind the scenes, I found out that a couple of them were undermining the plan and had got into the CEO's ear and asked him to just hold off for a while. So I spent nearly 3 months at my desk twiddling my thumbs, waiting for the CEO to let me off the chain to do this. And eventually I went to him and I said, okay, you either have to let me off the chain to do this, or you need to accept the fact that you don't want me to do it. You don't need me around. And a couple of days later, I had my redundancy papers. And that was simply because at least one of the senior managers, perhaps a couple, were saying, yes, great idea to my face, and behind the scenes going, nope, that erodes my personal power and I don't want anything to do with it. But there's very little you can do when you're not getting feedback, when you're getting that kind of passive aggressive approach. I haven't come across the Gen Z stare myself, but I think it would fall into the same category. If you're not getting any feedback at all, there's nothing you can do with it. Right. So in my case, when I wasn't getting the feedback that allowed me to tweak my culture change program, so perhaps it included this person in a better way, when there was nothing I could do with that, the best thing I could do was exit. The only thing I could do was exit. Yeah. I think it's the same with the Gen Z stare, right? If you're not going to take the time to give me some feedback on how I might improve this, well, then there's nothing else for me to do except disengage. So if making somebody disengage is what you're going for, by all means, keep using passive aggression, keep using the Gen Z stare. But if you genuinely want to make progress, you know, how many times have we spoken on this podcast about the importance of feedback? It doesn't have to be hierarchical. It can be from anyone. Yeah. And this is one of the reasons I think feedback is a superpower. It allows us to move forward. Yeah.
What about we flip the side and we talk about healthy conflict? What does that even look like? Is that a myth?
I don't think it's a myth at all. I think it's how you build trusting relationships. you know. Yeah, I mean, you and I have had a couple of conflicts in our time. And I think that's one of the reasons that our friendship is as strong as it is. I think it's one of the reasons that we work as well as we do together is because we know what pisses the other one off, right? And we've learned that by going, uh-oh, I've done something to piss Matt off here. I need to lean into that and try and work out what it is. Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I've done that perfectly by any means, but I think in any trusted relationship you have, you can go back to a point where you go, and we almost didn't make it through that. You have to have that conflict in order to build a proper trusting relationship. There's that old saying, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. You've got to learn to navigate the turbulent waters as well. So I think if you want to build a trusting relationship with somebody, you have to be prepared to have a conflict with them, particularly if what they're doing is pissing you off in some way, you know?
One of the things I think you do beautifully well, Rob, even when it's a shit fest, right? Is you literally pause, you breathe, and you ask amazingly calm, curious questions. And I'm sure on the inside, things are screaming, but those questions are like invitations for conversation, for dialogue. And I have a huge amount of respect, your ability to be able to keep so beautifully calm in those moments, right? Where you can ask, are we good? So are we good? Just small questions, and it just literally opens the door if things are not. We can have a conversation on that.
I think you're misremembering slightly there. I think there have been times where I've been horribly aggressive and angry. My wife would tell you the same. There have been times where we've had little arguments where, I've arced up. However, I think when I do have the time to sit back and reflect on it, I will often go, right, this is somebody who's not behaving in the way that I expect them to behave. So there must be something else there. I need to work out what that is, Yeah. And usually you find out there's some sort of a fear motivator behind it. And you've got to do your best to try to take that fear away in some way. And I think the way to understanding where that fear comes from is to ask those genuinely curious questions, to try to work out what is it that's firing up this behavior in the person. You can also turn that back on yourself and go, what's making me angry here? Why am I so pissed off by this? And what you'll find when you dig deep into it is the reason I'm pissed off here is because this is somebody I really care about.
Yeah.
And I don't like this conflict between us. So I need to find a way to solve that. But I think that painful curiosity is really important.
Are you comfortable, Rob, we share one of the conflicts that we had so that listeners can kind of understand from our stuff-ups that are going through? Is that okay?
Sure.
There's one that comes to mind, and it was actually to do with corporate therapy itself, right? We were wanting to build a community. It was early on in the piece, and I'd been burnt in a previous partnership, and it hadn't gone well for me. So I wanted to avoid being burnt. I wanted to avoid IP being stolen. I focused very much around, okay, ChatGPT, help me out here, structure up an agreement between Rob and I. I thought ChatGPT did a marvelous job. It ticked all the boxes, it did it under 30 seconds, and I probably didn't think too much about it because it was nicely formatted, which I'm very visual. So away we shot it off to Rob. Over to you, Rob. What was it like receiving that landmine?
I remember receiving the agreement and thinking to myself, this is just going to stop me from doing this work with this person and my own work over here. And anything I give to Matt becomes his IP. And I was just like, nah, I'm done. It's been fun up until this point, but I'm done. I can't do that. And I made the fatal mistake of sending you an email. Sending you an email going, here are all of the tiny little things that I have issue with in this agreement. And you straight away, if I recall correctly, came back and said, I'd love to have a chat about this. And I went, I'm too angry. Give me a few days and we'll work it out. And I spent a few days angry until I got into the curiosity of what made Matt think this was a good plan. And that was when I remembered you being burnt in a previous partnership. And I went, okay, I get it. What I need to do is get across to Matt that I'm not the kind of guy who's going to burn him, that we've had a good working relationship up until this point. We'll continue to have one into the future. probably don't need a legal document in order to make it work. What I found amazing about that interaction was I remember being in a hotel room in Sydney, firing up a Zoom meeting with you.
Yeah.
And within 15 minutes of us having a conversation, we were back to being the best mates again.
Yeah.
And we were back to being excited about doing this stuff, about doing podcasts and learning snacks and putting a community together and all of that kind of thing. So I think we were guilty of some of the things that we spoke about in that list earlier. I certainly was guilty of crappy communication and not listening to the genuine fear that you had underneath it. And I think if I had been more genuinely curious from the start, if I had picked up the phone rather than writing that shitty email, I think we'd have been okay.
I think the important one for the listeners, though, is like, one, choose your communication so carefully. Assumptions is the mother of all pain, right? You just got to be so careful on both of us on how that played out. When using AI, use with caution would come through, would clearly be for it. I think the other one, though, is we deeply cared about each other. And I remember that call well, because we were looking for clues like, have we really resolved this? Have we both aired what was concerned? And it got deep and very quickly, very emotional, but we both had to be vulnerable in that conversation.
Yes. For
it to have been resolved. I don't think if we both hadn't been vulnerable, would have that had any chance for that reconnection, that rekindling happening. And so thanks for that, Rob. That made a world of difference.
And likewise, mate. But I think it's hugely important, is that we both took the time to try to take that conflict and turn it into a bit of momentum. We both said, right, let's just take this. And I think we took, a half hour, 40 minutes maybe, to just say the things that needed to be said, to be vulnerable, to talk about what our fears were, And I heard you when you said you had a fear of being burnt again. And you heard me when I said I had a fear of not being able to do work elsewhere and so on. And we ended up in a position where we went, okay, it's all on the table. And we're still good, right? And I think the reason we're still good is because we do care deeply about each other. That was what got it across the line. If you had been somebody that I didn't give a shit about, I'd have gone, well, I guess I'm not working with Matt anymore, And
I think that nicely leads into some of the habits we would encourage for folks when working for conflict, is don't wait for the conflict to have actually happened for you to get to know a person. It's like you actually have to, your colleagues, whether they be in the marketing teams, the finance teams, the IT teams, go hang out with them, get to learn and understand their world, because a little bit of empathy, a little bit of compassion really helps you have a much more stronger understanding as to why their motivations or why their behaviors might be the way. To me, that's a fundamental first step. Go hang out with folks, go learn their worlds. What would be some of the early steps you would encourage for folks when it comes to conflict and habits, what they should embrace?
You've mentioned one of them just now, which was to be okay with being vulnerable. I think we got each other when we both went, okay, so here's what we're afraid of here. I know we see fear as a weakness, something to be avoided, but there are basically only two motivators, love and fear. And if you're being motivated by fear, get it on the table, because often what you're afraid of is not what the other person had in mind at all, and if you can get that out on the table, that's a big deal. We've also spoken previously about setting behavioral expectations with people. You want to set up a scenario, an environment where it's safe to do that, where if you go, hey, here's what I'm afraid of, you're not going to get a backlash, which is, oh, Rob's just terrified of everything. People are genuinely going to listen. And setting up those behavioral expectations, I think, is a part that a lot of people miss, both with their teams and with their colleagues. You said get to know the other teams that you work with. If you're fortunate enough to be a leader of people, get to know the individuals and what motivates them. Yeah, we often talk about motivating teams. I don't think you can motivate a team. I think you motivate a group of individuals. All of those individuals are going to be motivated by something different. So you can't motivate them unless you understand what that is. So get deep into that would be one of my tips.
When it comes to setting up those expectations, one of the favorite activities I have is pretty much if you draw a line and down one end is DEFCON 5, like things have gone to hell in a handbasket, this is conflict at its worst. And up the other end is like, this is healthy conflict. This is us having a great debate. And it's about us moving the whole team or the organization forward through those healthy debates. Getting teams to be able to just put what behaviors actually lead toward DEFCON 5 or actually lead towards healthy debates is a really important part of sort of calibrating as a team as to what's cool or not. And you want to do that before you've had the team conflict. It's got to be early in the team forming. So they've got a chance to really say what's fair, what's something we're okay with, and where do we actually draw the line. By making it very visual, by talking it through, being able to share some examples, why is that important to you, really helps build some of those trust moments for team.
One of the things I used to like to do was when people had a very obvious difference of opinion, where one person says, we should go to war with the marketing team, and the other person says, no, what we should do is we should listen to the marketing team. I'll get them to argue the other person's point of view.
Yep.
So if Matt says we should go to war, I'll get Matt to argue, no, we should listen to them. And if Rob says we should listen to them, I'll get Rob to argue, no, we should go to war. So that they actually get an opportunity to be in the other person's shoes and see what it's like. You know, now that doesn't always work. You need pretty serious delineation between the 2 points, but it can be an interesting little exercise to try to get people into an empathetic space with the other person.
One of the things I think that when it comes to conflict management, I talk about is you need to say what needs to be said, and you're like, well, bloody obvious. The problem is teams use different languages to describe things. And so even if you feel you're being very, very clear coming across the team, if you're using something that only your group, your team, your silo uses, the chances are it's open to misinterpretation, even if it's face-to-face. Do you have any thoughts on best ways to tackle that, Rob? For me, I love to draw it. I have to draw. I'm not auditory at all, right? And so when Rob, which is ironic, we're on a podcast, but anyway, I need to draw it. It's one of those very important moments where I can start to see how things are landing. I also find by drawing, I'm actually a calmer person.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting because I'm probably the exact opposite. I'm about as highly auditory as you can get. So I like a good debate. I like a good argument. I spend a lot of time on YouTube watching debates between people. But one of the things that I realize about the people I keep going back to around debating is that they're not listening so that they can get a gotcha point. They're not listening so that they can argue harder. They're listening so that they can try to understand the point of view of the other person. Now, they may use that to go, but hey, have you thought about it this way? And try to land a point. But they're genuinely trying to understand the other person's viewpoint. There's a guy that I like called Alex O'Connor. He's on YouTube as the Cosmic Skeptic, I think. But Alex O'Connor is the guy's name. And he's a card-carrying atheist. So you see him debating religious folk all the time. But one of the reasons that I keep coming back to somebody like Alex O'Connor is you would never describe him as a militant atheist. He's a guy who studied theology and is genuinely trying to understand why theology landed differently with other people to the way it landed with him. And that's why I keep going back to him. So if you can listen to learn, if you can listen to understand somebody else's viewpoint rather than listening to try to win an argument with them, the conversation you have ends up so much more productive. Even if you don't change your mind or the other person doesn't change their mind, you at least come to some sort of an understanding of why that person holds the views that they do. And that allows you to motivate them better.
But in the heat of the moment, you're very passionate. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about before is separating the person from the issue. And what some of the ways you can get yourself into that reframing, because when your body's like literally on fire sort of thing and rage is about to take over, ready to strangle the living daylights out of them, and you're saying, Matt, you just need to separate the person from the issue. Really? What's the intervention? What's the pause?
It's a practiced art, Matt. That's the horrible thing that I've got to tell you. It's not something you can just switch on. I learned this very, very early in my career. So before I got into leadership and training and coaching and all of that fun stuff, I was a call center rep. Which is why I have the utmost respect for anybody who works as a call center representative, because you will deal with a number of angry callers every day. Yeah. And often they're angry about things that you would consider irrational if you took them at face value. Okay, so your internet's down. It's not the end of the world. We can get it fixed, But as far as this person's concerned, it's not just that their internet is down. It's that they hate the organization and they hate you for representing them. And I'm going to have a 5-minute rant about what an asshole you are before I ask you to fix my internet connection for me. That was where I learned to separate the person from the performance, right? Yeah. And you'll notice I said separate the person from the performance. It is a performance, right? When we're really angry, we tend to dial that up a little bit, right? We tend to go, I'm going to show you just how angry I am. I remember my wife, who was a call center manager at the time, and I had a problem with an organization I was dealing with, and I called their call center and I said, listen to this. This is what an angry customer is. And I turned it on and I was angry and I got my way and so on. And she sort of smiled at me at the end of the call and went, you're such an asshole. And I said, why? And she goes, because you weren't that angry. You turned it up. And it was a performance. It was a performance to try to get what I wanted from this organization. Something I felt I deserved, don't get me wrong, and something I felt was just and fair. But I was prepared to dial up the anger to make it happen. Yeah. And I think we need to bear that in mind. There's nobody who enjoys being angry. Yeah. Except maybe the lead singer from Rage Against the Machine. But aside from Zach De La Rocha, I don't think there's anybody who enjoys being angry. So often it is a performance. Often it's a way of trying to intimidate somebody into getting your way or trying to get them to back down in some way. So when somebody's being really angry with me, I go, it's not Zach De La Rocha. This is just a performance. This is not what they would be like if I were sitting there having a beer with them some evening in a pub somewhere. This is not the person. This is just the performance. Now, that's difficult to do. What I used to remind myself of when I was on the phones, I would have colleagues who would say, I hate when I get an angry customer. I just get really freaked out by that. And I would go, yeah, but why are we getting freaked out by that? Because what they're really displaying now are fight or flight responses. Yeah. If they choose fight, they're just going to shout louder at me. And you know what? I've got a volume control on the phone. I can just turn them down a bit. Yeah. If they go into flight mode, well, they're just going to hang up on me. Yeah. Either way, I'm going to walk home with exactly the same amount of bruises that I walked in with. Yeah. There's nothing they can do that's actually going to affect me for any length of time. So I used to just remind myself of that. There's nothing they can do to hurt me. And I'm just going to try to separate this person from their performance. I'm going to try to be curious about why it is that they ended up in this situation. I'm going to try to empathize with them. I used to say, I'm sorry you've experienced that. I'm glad you brought it to my attention. And I'm sure there's a way we can fix it together. Yeah. And that was usually enough to take them down to a level where they went, okay, I'm actually relying on you to help me here. So maybe I should turn the anger off. Yeah. I think it's really, really important to try to be curious about the person rather than the performance they're displaying at the time.
When it comes to, if you're nervous, if you're feeling anxious about a conflict, you're going to do your damnedest to try and avoid being in that space. And yes, in your mind, you're telling yourself, I know I should intervene early, but I've got this thing over here I need to do first, and then this thing. And then by the time you've let it run its course, it's now some whole different type of hellhole. How would you encourage leaders or individuals to intervene early when it feels so uncomfortable?
By reminding themselves that it's going to get more uncomfortable later. Yeah. The only thing that I think conflict has compound interest attached to it. Yeah. The longer you leave it, the bigger it's going to get. Yeah. And I think it's one of the downsides of us having a more short-term approach to some of the decisions that we make. I'm just going to avoid that conflict and I'll deal with it tomorrow, or the next day, or 2 weeks from now at our next one-on-one, or at their performance review in 6 months' time. And the longer you leave it, the bigger it gets and the harder it is to diffuse. What you want to do is deal with it before it becomes a problem. Yeah. In an ideal world, you would have no big conflict because you've dealt with it all when it was small. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's something that I've done the whole way through my career. That was a hard learned lesson. I had one guy who I noticed was a little bit stressed out with his work. And I should have dealt with it when I noticed he was a little bit stressed out with his work. But I was like, oh, it's a stressful job and he'll be okay. Yeah. And 2 weeks later, that guy burst into tears, telling me about how much he hated his job. I'm not saying I could have fixed it if I had dealt with it at the time, but I certainly could have dealt with it in a much less emotional, much more rational way. And I think that's the thing. Once emotion gets involved, and emotion's always involved, but once the emotion level ramps up, the conflict is much, much more difficult to deal with because it's much, much more difficult to separate the person from the issue.
So sometimes as managers, you'll join a team and there's already conflict. Like there's already shit's gone down, right? And you're inherited this team and two of the individuals won't chat to each other and these two won't sit near each other. And you're like, oh, what have I just walked into? Have you got a view, if you're starting out as a middle manager, you inherited a team, there's already conflict, what would be some of your early go-to moves there, Rob?
So I've had that exact scenario. I inherited a team of 4 once where basically they were all at each other's throats, but there were 2 of them in particular that were at each other's throats. And when I inherited the team, I got them in a room and the first thing I did was set behavioral expectations with them. I said, here's what I expect of you. Yeah. And I hadn't come up with these myself. They were things I had stolen from other organizations. One of them was Google's old "Don't be evil." If there's a good way you can do something in an evil way, choose the good way. Yeah. And the other one was "Don't F the customer," which used to be a stated objective of Atlassian. And by "Don't F the customer," I was basically saying, you're trainers. So your customer is the person who shows up in your training room. Yeah. If somebody asks you to do something that pollutes that learning experience in some way, don't do it. Come to me and I'll save you from it. The most important part of that interaction was when I said to them, okay, so those are my behavioral expectations of you. Now, what are your behavioral expectations of me? And instantly I got, you've got to protect us from that evil team over there because they're always trying to jump in on our turf. And after the meeting, I had the 2 people that were at each other's throats go, hey, I didn't want to say it in the meeting, but what you need to do is get that person to change their behavior in some way. And the other person was like, and what you need to do is get that person to change their behavior in some way. So I instantly got a pretty solid understanding of this is what they fear about each other. And this is what they fear about other teams in the organization. Yeah. Now, it was great to hear that they feared this other team in the organization because that gave me an opportunity to practice what I preached by shielding them from that.
Yeah.
It also gave me an opportunity when one of them threw the other one under the bus to go, hey, what part of "Don't be evil" did you not understand? I could deal with that there and then. They went from being a team that were at each other's throats 24 hours a day to being reasonably cohesive within about 6 to 8 months. It took a while. But at the end of my couple of years at that organization, those 2 were leaving at the same time that I was, or very close to it. And there were tears of, I'm going to miss you at leaving dues, whereas a couple of years previously, they would have gladly taken a shot at each other,
Yeah.
So those behavioral expectations, I think, are important simply because of the fact that it gives you an understanding of where this tension's coming from and how you might be able to diffuse it.
Where do you draw the line, though? Where do you kind of go, this is not working? Like, this is getting to the point. The conflict is not productive. It is dysfunctional. Where do you draw that line and what should you do?
So I think I've always had a fairly simple recipe for when performance management is warranted. Yeah. And it's that somebody knows they know what to do. They know how to do it. Yeah. And they choose not to. Yeah. And that to me is important, that choice. So in this example that I was talking about, one of my team had been called out by the HR director on the fact that there was inaccurate information in a presentation she was giving. And she blamed it on the other person in the team, despite the fact that it was her work, you know. So I looked at that and I went, you knew what to do, which was to fess up about the fact that it was your information. You knew how to do it. You should have there and then gone to the HR director. My bad, I screwed up. Yeah. But you chose to throw your colleague under the bus instead. Yeah. So we had a performance management conversation. I said, if this happens again, there will be repercussions up to and including termination of your employment and so on. Yeah. And we started a performance improvement plan. Now, changed her attitude straight away, and that performance conversation stuck. Yeah. And I usually find that if the first performance conversation sticks, we're fine. If it doesn't, if you move on to a second one, you're probably going to get to the end of that process. And, you know, it's not nice to do, but it's necessary to do in a scenario like that.
What if it's your boss, though? What if your conflict is like, oh, crikey, is this person determines if I'm hired, fired, or staying, getting a rise?
Yeah, I realize this is a pretty privileged position, right? I realize that there are some folks that are in their jobs because it pays the bills. It pays the mortgage. They've got car payments to cover, whatever it is. They've got children to raise, you know, things like that. But there have been scenarios where it has been my boss, and I've just gone, you know what? I'm done because I can't change this. I've tried. I've made an effort to influence the behavior in this individual. And if anything, in most cases, they double down on it after I tried to influence it. So I've gone, I just don't belong here. Now, if I'm in a position where I've got to pay the mortgage or raise the kids or pay the car payment or whatever it is, I will immediately start looking for a new job.
Yeah.
And I'll suck up the pain for the time that it takes me to find a new job. Yeah. But notice that I'm kind of checking out at that point. I'm realizing this is not for me anymore. Yeah. So I've done that on a couple of occasions. I've had a boss where our values and our behaviors were so different that I had no choice but to go, I don't belong here. Yeah. And that can be really hard to do. You know, in one of those occasions, I had a long relationship with that organization and I was very happy with it up to a certain point. So it was really difficult to leave the organization. I was of the opinion that I could, you know, maybe we could save it, or maybe if I just lasted a little longer, maybe my boss would move on and they'd be replaced by somebody else or what have you. But there comes a point where you've got to be pragmatic about it. You've got to be rational about it and go, it's actually not the place. It's the people that I like, and I can maintain a relationship with them even when I'm not here. But I need to move on because this place doesn't mirror my values anymore.
Do you feel that HR, what's their role in all of this and working through conflicts? Because I'm sure they get to see or hear a fair bit of it.
No doubt. I think we've spoken about this before. I think HR teams, more and more as time goes on, seem to be being merged with legal teams or having, you know, a general counsel as the head of the HR team as well. They're seen as a risk management part of the organization, managing media risk, legal risk, etc. If one of our employees makes a complaint, we don't want that to end up on a current affair and so on. So they go into legal risk compliance mode, you know, which is why my friend that I mentioned earlier got the legalese email back from HR after the investigation. Those HR teams see their role as protecting the company, not protecting the employee. The more progressive HR teams realize that the best way they can protect the company is by protecting the people, by helping them to deal with the sort of conflicts that we're talking about, rather than waiting until they get emotional and getting fired up by it, or worse, adding fuel to the fire. My friend that I mentioned, when he got this legalese report on the investigation that was done, it made him angry. It made him feel like his complaints had been dismissed, that they hadn't even been listened to. And all he was looking for was an acknowledgement. He said to me, having listened to one of our podcasts, I wouldn't have told them if I didn't care about the organization. I just would have let them shoot themselves in the foot. Where have you heard that before? But he felt that just from getting this legalese document back, that his concerns hadn't been, never mind addressed, they hadn't been acknowledged. So that made him more emotional, made the conflict fire up more. Now, I coached him through that, and he went and he had a conversation with the HR person the next day, and they were fine, because coming out of that meeting, he felt like his concerns had been listened to. So I think that's the danger is that HR teams, and don't get me wrong, I get why you would consider it your job to protect the organization from media risk or from legal risk. Nothing gets messier than employment law, right? But I think it's not too much of a leap to realize that if I really want to protect the organization from legal risk, the best way I can do that is to protect my employees.
So we've just talked about the role HR can play. And earlier we talked on about how AI nearly ended our partnership between you and I, and my poor use of it. Do you feel AI does have a role here in helping people to be able to work through conflict? Really keen to get your views, because you're not Mr. Technology under any day.
Oh, no, I'm very much, my tech days are behind me. There was a time that I could program modem strings from memory, but my tech days are very much behind me. And I've probably got a little bit more of a reticence to embrace AI than you do. That said, I see the value of it in a lot of ways. I think one of the things that AI can do here is to help you plan a conversation. Yeah. If you feed a framework, like, for example, the BICA framework, the BICA framework that we spoke about in feedback, if you can teach that to ChatGPT and then go, help me to design a conversation about this topic based on those BICA principles, it at least gives you a starting point, which can reduce the level of overwhelm that you might feel when it comes to dealing with conflict, when it comes to sort of dialing down the anxiety that comes with that. If you've got a couple of cogent, rational points that you can get across to people, even if it's just a starting point for the conversation, I think that little bit of momentum to kick you off, I think that's the area where AI excels. Yeah. I've often said to it, hey, I want to write a program on this topic. Tell me what an outline might look like. And you'll get some headings, and that's enough to get you started, to get you fired up, So I think AI can very much help in helping you to plan a conversation, or at least get the structure of it worked out. And I think that dials down the anxiety a little. It gets you from, I don't even know what I want to say to this person, to, well, at least now I've got 3 or 4 talking points that I can flesh out. And anything that dials down the anxiety and allows you to approach conflict in a more open-minded way, I think is worth its weight in gold. So that's one of the areas that I think AI can really help.
I think what you touched on there, Rob, though, is the importance of trying to have AI help you to figure out what questions you can ask to stay open-minded. Yes. Because I think the dangers when you start to use AI to hammer your point home, which kind of overrides all the, well, here's exactly 20 points and I've put in fair work at the same time and I've checked what legal had said and you're buggered, I've so won this one. So AI, use with caution is what I'd learned. And I think that's probably a brilliant place to wrap up today's corporate therapy. And what I'd like to remind folks is if your office is too quiet, you've either reached that mystical state of Zen or your team has stopped giving a damn. Either way, it's your job as a middle manager to find out which one it is. Rob, any thoughts from you on closing?
Just that conflict isn't necessarily chaos. A lot of the time it's movement, it's momentum. And when it's done right, it's actually how you build trust with the people that you care most about. Great things can happen when we learn to have a good argument.
Well, thanks for tuning in. Subscribe, share, and join us in the corporate therapy community. I'm Matt. Remember, you've got this.
Stay curious, folks.